Reception to the Lost Agent arc of Bleach has changed dramatically in the years since it first released. In fact, time has been very kind to this arc. What was once detested by a large portion of the readership has since been re-evaluated, and while the arc never quite hits the same highs of the other, bigger story arcs, it's also not really designed to. In fact, the triumphant climactic return of the Gotei 13 towards the end of the arc is perhaps its biggest moment, and also when the Lost Agent arc feels the least like itself. It's a slow burn, conspiracy-style thriller set to a very human backdrop that oozes noir atmosphere and intrigue. And at the same time, The Lost Agent delivers some of the most effective horror I've ever seen from the series. From a series renowned for twisted transformations and eldritch body horror nonetheless. So, while perhaps not as bombastic as the other arcs of Bleach, the Lost Agent arc absolutely has its fair share of standout, jaw-dropping moments, including some hard-hitting sequences that I think are often either forgotten or overlooked. So, in today's video, our latest installment in the Bleach's Best Scenes series, I want to look at one such moment. The arc uses its lessened scope effectively, luring the reader in with the promise of a smaller scale story, while really zoning in on the terror that a narrative is capable of evoking when focused on a more familiar, intimate setting. This time the human world and the people of Ichigo's life that are normally much further removed from his usual adventures. For the most part, especially with the threat of the Arrancar now behind us, the world of the living should mostly be a safe place for Ichigo and his friends, and the Lost Agent arc takes great advantage of that. We see that terror in full effect when the powers of Tsukishima's Book of the End are revealed in the arc's masterstroke climax, the absolute apex example that acts as the driving force behind the Lost Agent's final showdown. However, an earlier, much shorter scene features a moment that in my opinion is almost equally as horrifying for a different reason. And of course, the scene I'm referring to is when Ginjo deliberately slashes Ichigo's eyes, blinding him during their final training session, while then pretending to reveal himself as a malicious villain all along, while Ichigo is in one of his most vulnerable states we've ever seen. It's a moment of raw horror that works on numerous levels. For one thing, it's a gruesome sequence, the likes of which we've never seen before in Bleach. While Bleach often employs gore, it is usually heavily stylized. But here there is a feeling of taboo almost, when Ichigo's eyes are cut in such a brutal fashion, an early display of some of the darker elements that would creep into the series and would later flourish during the run of the Thousand Year Blood War arc. And thanks to Ginjo's sudden, shocking turn that follows immediately after, it is a scene that plunges the reader into a frantic few pages of uncertainty, one that combines the immediacy of physical horror with the dread of existential horror pretty perfectly. It's a scene that comes completely out of left field, one that uses the Lost Agent's smaller scale to its advantage, successfully subverting the reader's expectations that because the scale is smaller, so too must be the stakes. Not so, as it turns out. To begin, we'll take a look at the scene in question itself, including some of the build-up, though again there's not much of that, as this scene does come out of nowhere, essentially, and the immediate aftermath as well, to determine why this scene is absolutely one of Bleach's best. However, before we get started, guys, if you enjoyed this video when you're done with it and you want to see more from me and the channel, you want to stay up to date, especially while the Thousand Year Blood War Arc Anime Part 3 is releasing, then go ahead and make sure to hit that subscribe button down below right now, as it really does help me out, and I really do appreciate the support. So, as for the scene itself, it occurs at the very end of chapter 450, Blind Solitude. While the chapter title is a nice little piece of foreshadowing for what's to come, the reality is we had absolutely no idea going into this thing the first time. And for me personally, this chapter is a pertinent one in my Bleach journey. For it's the chapter that I stopped reading the weekly manga spoilers forevermore. Every single week I would find the spoilers for each chapter a few days prior to its official release and drink it all in. It was a part of my weekly Bleach ritual, and to be honest, I was just as excited for the spoilers as I was for the official chapter release. I remember visiting sites like One Manga and Bleach Exile, trying to see if spoilers had been released yet or not, and to be honest, I do kind of miss those days. But one day I decided I'd had enough of essentially ruining every chapter release for myself. While I didn't regret it, while I did enjoy the whole spoiler process, subconsciously I knew it was ruining the big reveals. Bear in mind that I'd been reading weekly Bleach spoilers since probably halfway through the Fate Karakura Town arc, if not earlier. I can't remember the specifics beyond that, truth be told. Anyway, I finally managed to shake it. Why did I choose this chapter, this week in particular? I have no idea, but I'm glad I did. For when I reached the end of chapter 450, I was completely shocked to see Ginjo blind Ichigo, slicing him across the eyes with his giant broadsword. And I know that it wouldn't have been the same had I spoiled it for myself a few days earlier. And so really, I guess what I'm getting at with this story is that by not having the chapter ruined for me beforehand, I was able to experience exactly what Kubo wanted us to experience in the way he intended. Anyway, this was the final stage of Ichigo's Fullbring training. Here he was finally going head-to-head with Ginjo himself, the two of them sealed within Yukio's virtual world. As Ichigo battles Ginjo, the two of them locking blades, Ichigo continues to wonder why he is struggling to read Ginjo's heart, why he doesn't feel anything emanating from Ginjo's sword about who he is or why he's really fighting. Believing Ichigo to be distracted, Ginjo decides to drag him back to the battle by force, and, in a shocking moment of what appears to be unfettered sadistic savagery, Ginjo slashes Ichigo's eyes. The panel in question is very well put together in my opinion. There is a sense that the injury is so violent that it has to be censored even here in the manga, with the reader only privy to the back of Ichigo's head as a thin but precise line of blood spreads out from his face. And even here, you can tell exactly what's been cut. This is the same series, by the way, that showed Matsumoto having her entire side torn out right before us on the page. Unleashing a horrible, blood-curdling scream, Ichigo doubles over, blood pouring from his now closed tight eyes. As the chapter ends, however, we see Ichigo attempt to open just one of his eyes, only to see a grisly cut running perfectly along the centre of it. It's a nice bit of attention to detail that doesn't go unnoticed. And the extent of Ichigo's injury is further reinforced by the following chapter. Every time we see Ichigo open his eyes, there is a prominent slash wound running across the centre of them, with blood occasionally erupting from the injury. I mean, it really is unlike anything else we've ever seen in Bleach. Now, admittedly, when we first saw this chapter, I think many of us guessed, at least initially, what was actually going on here. Blinding Ichigo seemed like the perfect way to awaken his ability to sense Reiatsu once more, and of course, that's exactly what's at play here. But that's merely the end result of what's otherwise a stellar sequence. The manga does a great job at showing us how a suddenly blind Ichigo would act. His fighting senses and instinct have been honed to such a degree that at the very least he continues to try and defend himself, but truthfully he is totally outmatched. And that's where Ginjo comes into play. Blinding Ichigo in such a dramatic fashion is one thing, but blinding him and then leaving him at Ginjo's mercy is another. Orihime is quickly sealed off from Ichigo, leaving him vulnerable and alone, and suddenly Ginjo's true nature appears to be revealed. While Ginjo has thus far presented himself as an ally to Ichigo, even explicitly stating that Execution wants to help Ichigo restore his Shinigami powers, Kubo has always depicted Ginjo as being totally untrustworthy from the start. Ginjo is shady by nature, and Kubo has a lot of fun with that. To be honest, while Kubo missed the mark with Ginjo as a character in some ways, for example his total lack of a backstory, in others I think he might be some of Kubo's smartest work. Ginjo is perhaps one of Kubo's most savvy inventions, in the sense that Kubo created him and knows exactly how the readership would react to him at every possible turn, thereby allowing Kubo to completely control this character's trajectory and narrative. In this sense, Ichigo really is a surrogate, an avatar for us, in a way that he isn't necessarily always. Ichigo doesn't trust Ginjo at all initially, but warily accepts his help because he doesn't have a choice, and we feel mostly the same way, though the Lost Agent arc does struggle a little bit with that narrative dissonance. You do kind of wonder, there must be so many other people that Ichigo could have spoken to. And I mean, surely a guy that looks like this can't be on Ichigo's side. Ginjo screamed evil in an almost comically over-the-top way. And yet, over time, as you spend some chapters with him and presumably see the real version of Ginjo, both we and Ichigo let our guard down a bit. And yet there's always something at the back of your mind telling you that something is off about Ginjo, but what could it be, and when, if ever, will it manifest itself? Well, apparently, that time is right now. Having blinded Ichigo, Ginjo suddenly explodes into this villainous rant, monologuing about how it was over for Ichigo the moment he stepped into this training room, and seemingly confirming all of the boy's fears at once. Ginjo savagely beats Ichigo, even going so far as to punch him square in the face, not even bothering to use his sword anymore, instead seemingly sadistically wanting to inflict as much pain in as humiliating a way as possible. What's interesting about this sequence, though, is that during his monologue, Ginjo never actually confirms his villainy. Ichigo admits he still had his suspicions, and Ginjo mostly just plays off that. It's only right at the very end, as Ginjo drives his sword into Ichigo's gut and tells him that he's going to kill Chad and Orihime, that he seems to finally take the mask off for good. However, what happens next is truly unexpected. If you never fully trusted Ginjo to begin with, then him being revealed to be the villain here is a moment of cathartic validation. You were right all along. Except you weren't. In this moment, Kubo played us all for fools once again anticipating how we would feel and react. Many of us were likely reading this chapter, nodding along with each passing page, noting that, yeah, I saw this coming eventually. Ginjo was clearly evil from the start. At the end of Ichigo's training, however, when he finally sees Ginjo's form illuminated in Reiatsu through even his blind eyes, a massive explosion goes off to signal the completion of Ichigo's Fullbring. And it's Ginjo who jumps on the grenade. And this is what's ultimately so clever about this moment. We're taken aback. Wait, what? Heavily injured, but with a warmer smile on his face, Ginjo now tells Ichigo that when a Fullbring is completed, someone else needs to be around in order to contain the release of the soul that's been building all this time. That's why he needed to have Ichigo complete his training in front of him. Apologizing for being a cheesy bad guy, Ginjo welcomes Ichigo into their group for real this time. And once again, our expectations have been shattered before our eyes. So, Ginjo isn't a villain after all. Certainly, this scene would seem to vindicate him of any potential wrongdoing. Kubo has now played the villain card. He has played up to our expectations, only to hoist it back immediately, revealing his true hand at the end. And Ginjo appears to be firmly on Ichigo's side, even sacrificing himself to contain Ichigo's power. Surely, now that Kubo has made it known that he expected us to think that Ginjo was a villain, surely that's the end of it. Surely Ginjo can't actually be a villain after all of this. It's very good stuff in my opinion, and it all begins with Ichigo's eyes being slashed. The gratuity of the violence might be simply explained away as Ginjo having crude methods, but in reality, the violence needed to be palpable for us to believe that yes, this is the real Ginjo we are suddenly seeing. It needed to be something that Ichigo couldn't easily come back from with Orihime sealed away. Ginjo needed to feel like a genuine threat in this moment, so Ichigo's ability to fight had to be taken away from him. But at the same time, it fulfills the goal of reawakening Ichigo's ability to sense Reiatsu. And of course, in an attempt to hammer home that Ginjo is actually a good guy, and that he and Ichigo now have the foundation for a solid relationship, of course, the next chapter opens immediately with a comedic scene between the two of them, to show that once again Ichigo's guard is down. Really, it's this exchange at the end of Ichigo's training that makes it so tough to accept Ginjo's true nature, as we see how good they could have been together as allies. Because of course we know that yes, this is all another ploy. In the end, Ginjo truly was a villain. But Kubo is working with multiple layers here in regards to this one character, this one creation of his designed to trick us over and over again, to make us think we know what's going on, only to then pull the rug out from under us. What's truly fascinating about this sequence to me from a writing perspective is that when Ginjo blinds Ichigo and pretends to be Ichigo's enemy, well, he truly is pretending. Ginjo is under the effects of Book of the End here, meaning he isn't his true self. So it's a triple bluff almost. Ginjo believes himself to be Ichigo's ally here due to the false backstory that Tsukishima has implanted inside him, unaware that truthfully he isn't. And yet he's having to pretend to be evil. It is oddly meta, and it works really well. I've always said that while absolutely not perfect, I would point to the Lost Agent arc as a great example of Kubo actually thinking ahead and planning out his stories, especially the shorter, more self-contained ones. The Lost Agent is another great example of that. Twists and turns like this, with these kinds of layers, simply wouldn't work otherwise, and they do hold up to scrutiny. So yeah, this is just one of many smaller, but still hard-hitting moments from the Lost Agent arc that help to prove why this arc shouldn't be underestimated. Because just like that, Kubo was willing to slice open Ichigo's eyes, which is easily one of the goriest, most savage moments in Bleach, and then play with both his and our expectations, throwing a major curveball our way with Ginjo's supposed true self coming out. Horror at both a physical and existential level as promised. It's not as crazy as what would come almost immediately after, probably the worst day in Ichigo's life, but it's a more intimate sequence, one that immediately makes you sit up in your chair. Perhaps you felt the arc was a little dry, a little boring, or maybe even a little formulaic, but this scene is enough to shake even the most veteran Bleach fan the first time they see it. It really is that unexpected. Admittedly, while I think the physical horror aspect of the scene works well on really any level, I think the success of the manipulation of Ginjo and his motives and the reader's expectations is dependent on how invested in the arc you are to begin with. But as someone who was invested in the arc week to week, I remember experiencing a roller coaster of emotions while reading this chapter, enhanced by the fact that I was no longer reading spoilers, and that's why this is one of Bleach's best scenes, at least in my opinion. Alright guys, but that's it from me, a short video for you today while I work on the review for episode 31 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. I do hope you enjoyed the video though and you got something of value from it as well. Let me know down in the comments, do you think this is one of Bleach's best scenes? What do you think of Ichigo being blinded by Ginjo and then Ginjo's false attempt at being a villain, a cheesy bad guy? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this scene down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to do this. If you like the work that I do here and you want to take that support from me another step further, thank you. By visiting the link to my Patreon in the description down below, you can support me over there at the $1 tier a month to get your name in the credits just like this, or at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every single video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright everyone, thank you so very much for watching once again. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.